Paul & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello everyone and welcome back to our Beyond Compliance Leading Workplaces Through Change podcast series. I'm Faye Calderoni, a partner in the employment team and co-lead of our Beyond Compliance offering for boards and executives. I'm your host for this series, and today we're looking at what psychosocial hazards are, what regulators now expect, and how leaders and boards should be overseeing them, especially when managing workplace change. So whether you're listening from the office, out for a walk, or on your commute, thanks for joining us today. Although there's a lot of grey and complexity that leaders are working through as they try and assess and control these hazards in the workplace, one thing that is certain is that they are no longer soft issues, but rather heavily regulated workplace risks with hard consequences. Today, I'm joined with two of the brightest minds in our national employment practice to help unpack these issues. Our special counsel, Jessica Luca and Nicholas Beach, both of whom specialise in workplace health and safety and employment law and regularly advise clients on managing psychosocial risks, not just in theory, but in practice. Welcome, Jessica and Nick.
Thanks, Faye.
Hello, and thanks, Faye.
Nick, I might start with you. Why has this become such a focus for regulators and organisations?
Yeah, look, there's been a real shift over the last few years. Psychosocial health is now treated on the same footing as physical safety under the workplace health and safety laws. And we're seeing a specific regulations across most jurisdictions that require businesses to actively identify, assess and manage psychosocial risks. So this is no longer just good practice, it's a legal obligation.
And importantly, I'll just jump in and add to that, Nick. Regulators aren't just issuing guidance in this area, they're now really actively enforcing it. We're seeing increased inspections, notices, and increasingly prosecutions where organisations fall short. So I think that's just important for employers to keep in mind as well. For example, in New South Wales, Safe Work New South Wales commenced targeted psychosocial enforcement campaigns in 2024, where they were issuing hundreds of notices. So they really are pushing compliance.
So true, Jess. There's no doubt there's extra boots on the ground and our clients are feeling it. But let's ground this a bit. I suppose we've jumped into what's happening in practice, but taking a step back, what actually are psychosocial hazards? Because I think a lot of people are still grappling with this concept.
Yeah, look, definitely, Faye. Look, at its core, it's any aspect of work. It can be its design, the management, or the environment, and that cause psychological harm. So, look, that includes how work is structured, how people interact, and the systems in place within the organisation.
What are the common examples that we should be thinking about, Jess?
Yeah, so the obvious ones are things like bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, excessive workloads, and poor organisational support. And those hazards show up in different ways in practice. So, for example, alleged failures to protect a worker from bullying and harassment or psychosocial risks arising from the way performance management is carried out. So it could be something that is obviously happening without the employer's consent, or something happening with employees from a bullying and harassment perspective, or an active process being carried out by a manager or supervisor.
Yeah, look, that's definitely right. What can be a psychosocial hazard is broad. You can have hazards like fatigue, exposure to traumatic incidents is another one. Isolated work sometimes comes up, or even environmental conditions, and depending on the workplace.
Tricky bit, isn't it, Nick? Because quite often employers just want a list. They're like, can you just give me a list? Give me a risk assessment, give me a template. And it's so hard to create a list.
Definitely. And look, it needs to be remembered it's very context specific. There's a lot of hazards you can think about and identify, but they're not all going to be in your workplace. What's in one workplace may not be in another. You've really got to identify it with some clarity.
That's right. And for example, there's been a significant matter involving a large public sector employer recently receiving a conviction following a worker suicide. So in that matter, the key issue was the organisation's failure to properly manage psychosocial risks arising from performance management processes. And despite clear signs that the worker was experiencing distress, there wasn't adequate escalation or support. But stress alone won't always amount to a breach of a WHS obligation. So in other matters, and there was one last year, a prosecution was actually withdrawn after hearing, recognising the evidentiary challenges in proving what is reasonable management action and what is a psychosocial risk. So it really is context specific.
Absolutely. But it also shows what you've just said there, that the consequences can be catastrophic. We're not just talking about hurt feelings here. So what does the regulatory framework look like now?
Yeah, look, I'll jump in on that. Look, it's good in a sense that there's quite a bit of alignment now across jurisdictions. Most of them follow the model workhouse safety framework, and that carries with it consistent definitions of both psychosocial hazards and risks.
But there are some nuances, and for example, Queensland specifically identifies sexual harassment and gender-based harassment as psychosocial hazards, and Victoria has introduced relatively detailed psychosocial and psychological health regulations. One other emerging example is in New South Wales, where recent changes have expressly brought in digital work systems into the framework. So it's important because psychosocial risk doesn't just arise from interpersonal issues. It can also come from the way technology allocates work, measures performance, or monitors workers. If a system is driving unreasonable workloads, excessive surveillance, or pressure through constant metrics, that can also create a psychosocial risk, just as much as poor supervision or poor job design. So it's a good reminder that organisations need to look at technology as part of their overall systems of work.
It's true, Jess. I just did a presentation on this week, which was my first sort of exclusive AI and psychosocial safety one. And the more I read, the more I realised how important this issue is, but also how few organisations are actually thinking about it. But you're right, operations operating across different jurisdictions, it's a different regulatory framework. They have to pay attention to local differences.
Yeah, look, definitely, Faye. That's always going to be the case in this field, I think. Look, as the general concept and overall, I think the direction of the way the regime is working, it's all now getting far more consistent. So that's a good thing that at its sort of base, there's a solid foundation, a logical consistency across all the jurisdictions.
It's refreshing because it's confusing enough as it is without having to box tick differently. So, okay, let's turn back now to the practical side. How do organisations identify these psychosocial hazards?
Yeah, look, as I mentioned earlier, that's really the first step and a very important one. And it's unfortunately, in some sense, it's not straightforward. You can't just go to a single source of information or just check one thing in the workplace. You can't rely on something single. It's more than that.
Yeah, that's right, Nick. So looking at multiple data points, things like staff surveys, workers' compensation claims, incident reports and exit interviews, anywhere where you can source and get an idea of where the risks may lie.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I've found recently, just as importantly, you need to actually speak to workers. It sounds sensible and obvious, but you need to actually understand how work is being done on the ground. It's all well and good looking at sort of data and so forth, but getting that impression of how things are actually working on the ground is equally as important.
Closer to it, aren't they? If you want to know what, particularly with things like third-party risks, customer risks, for example, the best people to know are not the people sitting in the boardroom or at exec level. It's the people that are interfacing every day. And the only way you can assess those risks or control those risks is to have those conversations. It's more than a desktop exercise. So once hazards are identified, how do organisations assess the level of risk?
Yeah, look at the next step. That's equally important as identifying it. Once you've figured out which one's relevant, this assessment task is equally important. There's some guidance on this, and the key things are the concepts of duration, frequency, and severity. So the three big things.
So duration, frequency, and severity. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah. Look, duration, that's how long the exposure lasts. So you can have anything at one end or one off. incident, or you can have something at the other end, something that goes on for months or even years. So that's duration. Frequency, that's how often. So how often has it happened? Is it, say, rarely? Is it occasionally? Or is it something that happens constantly? So you got to figure out on that scale. And then finally, severity. Well, that sort of looks at both the intensity of the exposure. Some exposures are more intense than others, and also that potential consequences. So all those three things need to be factored in for each of the identified hazards.
Yeah, Nick, and those consequences can vary significantly from short-term fatigue through to serious long-term conditions like depression or other chronic illnesses.
Yeah, that's true. So do organisations need to consider cumulative effects?
Yeah, look, it's one of those things that isn't thought about too much, but there's definitely a focus on it because unlike, say, physical hazards, it plays an important potential role in psychosocial hazards. They don't operate usually in isolation, psychosocial hazards. You might have a single incident which has a far greater impact if someone is already, say, experiencing ongoing stress or lack of support. So that there's that duplication, that cumulative effect. So that's why things like repeated exposure matters so much as well. So whether it's sustained pressure through a performance process or, say, repeated bullying and harassment, or even things like ongoing exposure to aggression, say, from a third party like a client.
Yeah, that's right. Makes sense, Nick. So let's talk about controls now. How should organisations be managing these risks?
Yeah, it's every other risk. The principles stay the same. It's not just different because it's psychosocial. So the starting point is the usual principle that you apply to all risks. If you can eliminate the risk, if it's reasonably practicable to eliminate it, well, that's where you go. Now, often that's not achievable. So if you can't do that, then you minimise it using the most effective controls at your disposal.
Jess, I know you've been doing a lot of these practically. So as our practical queen in the business, tell us, what does this look like?
Thanks, Faye. Well, there's higher order controls or lower order controls, and you'd always start with the higher order controls, and that might include things like redesigning jobs or improving work systems, changing reporting structures, or things like reviewing how sensitive processes like performance management or disciplinary processes are conducted. So if there's a known risk of aggression from clients or customers, that might also mean introducing clearer escalation paths or staffing changes, considering other environmental adjustments or adding security measures.
Yeah, just to jump in, as Jess said, look, they're the best controls, usually the most effective. And as Jess said, there's low order controls as well. And they're things like your policies, your training, instructions. They've obviously got a place and they're still important, but generally they're less effective, particularly on their own.
So interesting that you refer to training as a lower order control, because that's usually the default position of any organisation, or what we're told, isn't it? But we did the training. We did the training 5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly, Faye. Look, and that's one of the key issues that comes up a lot. Training and policies often too heavily relied upon. Often the easy way. Picking up one of the examples Jess mentioned, there's an ongoing case involving Services Australia where an employee was exposed to aggression by a third party. And in that case, I think it was a client. And the allegation against the employer is that the risk of aggression was already known, but appropriate controls weren't implemented or reviewed. And the case really highlights the overlap between the physical safety risks, which in that case is violence, and psychosocial risks. And the expectation is that organisations should actively respond to known and repeated hazards rather than simply relying on those low order controls like training and policies that have been sitting there for a while, say.
And some of the jurisdictions, have actually made it explicit that you can't rely on primarily lower control measures if there are more effective controls, like changing how work is done, that are reasonably practicable. So it is always important to be considering the higher order controls first.
It's an important point that I think many listeners, if our experiences in practice are right, won't even appreciate. So thank you so much. So what does good governance look like in this space?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. It's obviously got a lot of potential aspects to it in any particular environment. But look, the good place to start is codes of practice. They are produced with this very issue in mind. So how do you practically implement the steps that you should in order to achieve compliance? So start there. Good practical guidance on compliance and see if you can implement what they suggest.
And beyond that, other documentation is pretty critical. So regulators are increasingly asking to see detailed risk assessments and documents of control measures and records of complaints or incidents that have been sent through. So anything to document what we've identified in the past as a hazard and what steps we've taken. So how we've responded to complaints or warning signs, reviewed those controls when risks are escalated, and complied with any notices in the past.
It's a lot, Jess. The aspirational policy, we will ensure your health and safety. We will do our best to ensure your health and safety. Probably not enough anymore.
Look, definitely, you need to be able to show how you've actually applied the requirements in practice, how they've actually been implemented and actually work, not just here's the document that says what we expect should be happening. So, yeah, very much needs to be able to be demonstrated and verified and displayed that way to anybody who's asking.
On consultation, Jess, I know a lot of businesses look at it as a box ticking exercise, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, beyond being required, it's really important for businesses to consult with their workers throughout the risk management process, not after decisions have been made. And that's not just to get their feedback, but really you might not understand what the hazards are or the full extent of the potential hazards without going through that consultation process.
Right. What about reporting obligations? I think that's something people still grappling with.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, Faye. Look, often I get asked about that because it's complicated. It's been complicated for a while because mainly the recording obligations were designed for physical sort of hazards and physical incidents and those sort of things, not so much the psychosocial issues. There's still some uncertainty about when psychosocial incidents should be formally notified to a regulator. There is some positive steps being taken, at least in the sort of model space, where the model laws are now incorporating some better regime around notification in this space, which will obviously only be applicable in jurisdictions if they adopt those requirements. But look, it's still unclear, but there's some movement to make it far more clear.
Yeah, that's right. I have had the same experience. So the trend is towards broader reporting expectations, and it is a bit unclear. So where there's doubt, a safer approach is to carefully assess and err on the side of caution and report where you're unsure. But like Nick said, hopefully we'll have some greater certainty around that soon.
Thank you both. Such a practical and worldly discussion for what is such a complex issue. Thank you for demystifying it for our listeners and for your time today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions or want to chat about anything we've covered today. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.